into other types of narratives. So the first thing that we note here is that archaeology offers us a way to make some comparisons among plantations. The archaeological record of plantations exists. We can go excavate as many plantations as there are available to study. So we can compare them in ways that you don't necessarily have the possibilities of comparing them historically. So we can ask the question, is Prospect Hill, is Farquarson's Plantation, is the day-to-day life and record of that journal typical? Is it representative of what's going on these plantations, or is it somehow exceptional, or a combination of both? Sort of what does it illuminate? What can we fill in gaps with? Archaeology also allows us, and if any of you have read the work from Clifton Plantation by Lori Wilkie and Paul Farnsworth, they focus very strongly on the fact that archaeology can tell us about daily life. It's these very mundane, pedestrian artifacts that people use day in, day out that comprise the archaeological record that also give us this sense of what people are doing that comprise the day-to-day lives that they're living. It then allows us to connect these plantations on many different scales. We can look at day-to-day life, we can look at compare on the same island, we can compare plantations between islands, and then through the Caribbean. So we can build this sort of comparative framework as big as we'd like it to go. And to do that, we have to place Prospect Hill not just in broader historical contexts, but also archaeological ones. And so to do that, I want to sort of talk to you about how we've integrated Farquarson's Plantation, Prospect Hill Plantation, into a bigger research project with this very big goal of comparing plantations on San Salvador to try to learn about life on out islands or family islands. Now, I'm not going to insult anybody's memory of their schoolwork here, but it's probably been a long time for most of you since you had to identify geography quizzes of islands in the Bahamas. San Salvador is right here in the central Bahamas. And this is a GIS map of the island done by the University of New Haven around the year 2000. There are a series of plantations, at least 8 that are historically known, and then archaeologically there are several unnamed plantations and other types of central side of the island. So that gives you some sort of an orientation as to where we've been spending our time working. The way that we framed our research is a little bit different than other people. The idea of how different cultures come together. So you have Africans, you have people from England, you have people from the southeastern United States, you have people being brought in from elsewhere in the Caribbean to a single location. The idea of creolization is how is it all of these different people come together with all these different cultures, these different languages, these different worldviews to shape a shared identity. In other words, our research question is really, how is it that people became Bahamian? At what point did people start to realize that they weren't Yoruba, that they weren't from so-and-so's plantation in Georgia, that actually something starts to change where they start to identify with their local community and a broader sort of sense of identity here. And so what we've tried to do is think about this as a long-term process. And I'm going to say this, I know at least one person in the audience has read all of Wilkie and Farnsworth, and they confine their idea of creolization to the period of enslavement. They're really looking at a single historical moment when people are still enslaved to see how their sense of identity is changing by coming to the Bahamas. Dr. Burton and I, sort of when reading and sort of thinking about this problem, realized that people's senses of identity are always changing. And so what we've tried to actually do is elongate the historical perspective on this. How is it that people during enslavement, after enslavement, when they're sharecropping, all of these different changes, how does all of those changes lead to a sense of being a Bahamian as opposed to being something else, not Bahamian? So it's an interesting kind of question, and what we found, I think you'll find somewhat interesting based on our work that we're trying to put Prospect Hill into. So our work, and this is dirty archaeology, this is the legitimate picture. I don't always look like this in the field, right? There I am taking copious notes at Caramount Plantation, sitting in the window of the manor house. We've done work since 2004. We did 3 field seasons of work at Polly Hill Plantation, 1 year of work at Caramount Plantation. We split that season with a modern 20th century, now abandoned settlement called Polly Hill Settlement. And then we spent last year working in the main sort of central site area of Farquarson's Plantation, and on Sunday we leave to go excavate the slave quarter, and that's going to complete our archaeological picture. And Care Mount Plantation, which we'll also be talking about a little bit, is a little bit north of Prospect Hill, all on the east side that comes up. Holly Hill that we'll be talking about is up in this part of the island here, settlements. Prospect Hill is down here by the big mouth of Pigeon Creek, the estuary. There's some work that was done by Kathy Gerace in the 1970s at Sandy Point and also at Fortune Hill that afford us sort of even more comparison here. So it's good to study all on one island sometimes and get this comparative framework. So what I want to show you is what we have found archaeologically by trying to put an emphasis on looking very locally in terms of what was happening on family islands at this time, is that there are a series of time periods that we've found in the archaeological record that don't necessarily match up to the traditional timeline of Bahamian history. If you read a typical narrative of Bahamian history, you often read about the Loyalists and the period of plantations ending in 1834, that emancipation marks a major shift in what's going on in the Bahamas. You then have, and I realize number 3 on the right here is really fluffy. There's lots of stuff that's been written about, but you do have this sort of everything that starts to happen after emancipation, and then all of a sudden you have this independent nation of the Bahamas. And one of the things that we've noticed is this type of history is really based on historical records that come from Nassau. Archaeologically, and I'll show you the evidence for this, sort of how we see it, is it seems that the pace of change in people's lives is very different on these out islands based on particular historical conditions. So we have the initial period of slavery that we believe sort of lasts until about 1810. And that's the time when all of the planters, with the exception of Charles Farquharson, have abandoned their plantations and moved back to Nassau. At the time, these plantations then come under the oversight of slave overseers. So while people are still enslaved, their day-to-day life changes dramatically because you have basically the entire population of the island, save 3 or 4 people, it's a slave population living independently. So while they're not free, they're certainly living a very different life than they would have when all of this sort of white overseer structure of the planters was here. And then we then see another major change, and this is the period that I'm going to show you. Things start to really look like what we would think of as Bahamian when comparing it to contemporary island life in the later part of the 19th century. So it's a much longer period of change, and it's very different than the changes that seem to take place in Nassau, where you have a different sort of social dynamic. So let's start with this idea of the plantation period with the planters present. And look at what the slave population looked like. Okay, so we know who was living on these plantations from slave records, and we do get a picture of what Bahamian slavery was like. It's very different from other places in the Caribbean. We know that the majority of the slaves were from elsewhere in the Caribbean or the southeastern United States. A smaller percentage of them are from Africa. We're not seeing the imports. Here in Nassau, you have free blacks with a relatively balanced sex ratio where they can have natural population increase. So it's a very relatively stable growing population dynamic on these plantations. And so this is an archaeological map of Polly Hill Plantation. It's the same map, and I'll sort of talk you through it. But one of the things that we noticed is when you look at these plantations coming in quite regularly, even after, well, not quite regularly, but after 1807, that's not so much the case on the out islands where people are not moving quite the same way. And it seems that people are living in nuclear families. It's clear that the Loyalists came to the Bahamas with a clear idea of what plantations were supposed to look like. The establishment of plantations in the Bahamas is relatively late in the British Caribbean. These people were living in the southeastern United States, even if they weren't planters themselves. They were around plantation society, had seen plantation houses, and they set it up in a very distinct way. So here on the left, and I'm going to try to point and talk out at the same time. This is good teaching practice, right? You don't talk to the screen. I'll do my best to do this, right? This is a map of the walls. This is the system of walls This was a hard-fought victory to get this map. The vegetation, this was a completely overgrown plantation, and so we had to cut out. But what you can see is a whole series of